Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to the Quianna Canada show. I'm your host, Quianna Canada, and we have a lot to talk about this evening. But before we get into today's topic, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button, share this video. We're going to get into some interesting, I guess, for me, this topic is going to be interesting, and I hope it's interesting for you. When you subscribe to this channel, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. So, what it does, to reiterate, is it tells the algorithm that videos like this are important. But, ladies and gentlemen, just because videos like this aren't pushed up in the algorithm does not mean that videos like this are not important. Now, I do have an announcement and a disclaimer. So, as an announcement, it's important to understand that I am still going through transnational repression. So, transnational repression is where states reach across their borders to silence the dissent of their citizens. Now, they do this in a number of ways. So, some of the most, I guess, common ways and identifiable ways that they do this is through digital repression. And so, this involves uh, accessing unlawfully the dissentant's, the dissident's voice. Excuse me, accessing unlawfully the dissident's social media accounts and their social profiles, and so sometimes they are occupying that their social profiles. So, for example, right now, my social profiles are being occupied by the state and its influential cyber hackers who know how to shape people's thoughts, opinions, and beliefs. And so, whenever anyone looks at my social profiles, especially my Google Knowledge Panel, oftentimes people think that like I'm actually changing what is on my Google Knowledge Panel or that I have control over it. But ladies and gentlemen, the truth is that this is being done by the state and its very skillful cyber hackers. But we are not going to let that stop us, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue because that is important, that we must continue to uh, live to fight another day, and that is peacefully. Now, as a disclaimer, in this video, I am going to be talking about Black history, and part of talking about Black history, ladies and gentlemen, it has to do with white supremacy. Now, when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about all white people, but what I've learned as a Black American talking about white supremacy is that when you do talk about white supremacy, oftentimes what will happen is that white people will identify with that. They will think that you are talking about them. And so, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing that I can do about that. I can't help how people feel about it if they are connecting themselves to, uh, when I say white supremacy, then that has something to do with them, not me. Again, I must reiterate when I'm going to be talking about white supremacy in this live, but my conversation and my discussion about this is not saying that all people have white supremacist ideology. Now that we got that out of the way, uh, ladies and gentlemen, there has been, if you have been following some of the discourse in the United States, there is a rift with Black Americans and Africans. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to go deeply into why I believe this rift is happening. And before I do, I want to say that, as a Black American who is residing abroad, in many instances, I have had cordial relationships with African people. And most nations, so when I lived in Canada, when I lived in Sweden, when I lived in the Republic of Ireland, I was around a lot of Nigerians, and Nigerians have always made me feel at home. Like they're some of the most welcomed and nice people that you can ever meet. They, open their homes to you. They make you feel like like you're part of the community. And I'll give you an example. And lady, I'm just trying to ease into this subject because I know that um, when I talk about this, some people are going to feel uh, hit by it, hit by what I'm saying. And again, that's not my intention or that's not my position. And if you have an emotion about what I'm talking about in this video, then that is something that you really have to contend with on your own. And again, I'm doing my best in this video to bring this discussion or to have a discussion and to illuminate an issue that I feel is prevalent in the Black American and African diaspora. But before I get into that, like I said, I'm talking about. I want to continue my story about how I've been treated with by Nigerians, and they've always treated me with the utmost respect. So, for example, when I was in Canada, I had a Nigerian friend, and she was one of the persons that I knew I was going to be friends with, and we became like really good friends and developed a really really strong friendship. And she was church going. She loved to go to church, and you know what? I'm not religious. I don't go to church. I'm a deist, and so I don't believe in religion. I do subscribe to the idea that there is a higher power, but I don't think that we as human beings really understand that because this higher power is all powerful. And, I feel as human beings, we really don't have that knowledge. And so one day she invited me to attend um, her church. And so, like, I did, knowing that I wasn't interested in church or knowing that I wasn't interested in religion, but just as a support system for her. And just because this was something that she was doing, I wanted to support her on her day, I decided to go. And when I went to the church, and it when I went there, ladies and gentlemen, do you know what they did? So, they everybody stood up and they were clapping and they were like, "Welcome." They asked me what my name was, and I told them my name, and they were like, "Welcome, Quianna. Welcome. We're so glad to have." And it was like it made me feel, ladies and gentlemen, it brought me to tears. Like, oh my God, it brought me to tears. Like it was like the most embracing, sweetest feeling that I ever had. And although that didn't change my mind about religion, it didn't change my mind about church. Like I felt really welcomed, and like I was, so grateful to her that she brought me into that experience. Okay, and so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying that to say that it is possible for Black Americans and Africans to have strong relationships and to have a strong connection and to be unified. But what's fueling the division between Black Americans and Africans is the question. And ladies and gentlemen, I am of the opinion that what is fueling this divide between Black Americans and Africans is state agents with white supremacist ideologies. And so I want to go ahead and get into that. So I'm going to start within the United States of America. Right now, there is several executive orders that has been signed in the United States that are having a huge impact on immigrants. And we know that this is touching immigrants from all walks of life and from all ethnicities and nationalities. So we have seen this touch Mexicans, Hispanics, Africans, and even Europeans. For example, ladies and gentlemen, there was a Trump supporter, female, who did a video and she was talking about some of the deportation letters that she got in the mail. And I think that she was quite surprised that she was getting a deportation letter because she was arguing that her self and I think her loved one, I think it was maybe her loved one, if I am to speak correctly. And she argued that her boyfriend or her husband or whoever this person was to her, she was arguing that he was not an undocumented immigrant, that he was documented. But yet, those policies had a far reaching effect and actually touched upon her life and, of course, her relationship. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening in the United States is that there is a divide between the Black American community and the um, the African diaspora, and I want to explore the reason why that is. And again, I want to reiterate that I am trying to be sensitive about how I talk about this, but of course, I need to talk about it very candidly. And so, there has been some YouTubers and social media influencers that are Black American that have talked about this issue at length. And there has been some tension over some Twitter spaces between Black Americans and Africans. And so some of the arguments that are coming from um, the African diaspora is that Black Americans are African as well, and that Black Americans are likely to be deported as well because, of course, they're saying that, we came from Africa and that when we were brought to the United States through the transatlantic slave trade, that really didn't solidify and, you know, it didn't cement our status into the United States of America. From the Black Americans' point of view, is that Black Americans, although we came from Africa and we came through the transatlantic slave trade unlawfully and against our own violation, Black Americans have argued that we had, uh, you know, like we became our own ethnic group. And so we had an ethnogenesis. We became our own ethnic group through this process because of throughout the years of living in the United States, being descendants of slaves, like we became a new ethnic group. Now, some people don't subscribe to that idea, but that idea does make sense because if you have a group that is planted in a country for uh, centuries and centuries and centuries, years and years and years, over 200 years, then there is like an evolution there. And so there it is an evolution, a new development that is taking place. And so to me, that argument does seem to hold weight. I've did a little research, but haven't done enough on it. So I haven't researched it fully, but it does make a little sense to me. And so that's the argument, right? And then there is the second argument that I think is more pertinent to this topic and what we're talking about today. Ladies and gentlemen, now the the social media influencers that are discussing this topic are, I think they've discussed it for a very long time, right? And through their discussions, now it's becoming a very volatile topic, and there is a lot of tension in the social media spaces on this topic. And one of the a question that's raised is often, why can't Black Americans and Africans unite? And ladies and gentlemen, I think this is becoming quite clear to me what the problem is. But to survey the argument from social media influencers, especially in the United States of America, who are Black American, they argue that whenever Black Americans, or okay, I'm jumping the gun. Let me go back. So, Black Americans, so through the transatlantic slave trade, there is a different um, struggle, right? Black Americans have a different struggle than the struggle that Africans have. So, for example, Africans, their struggle is really found. So, whenever I think, whenever excuse me, whenever Africans have a struggle within the continent of Africa, the struggle is usually about tribalism or some cultural disagreement. And I think that, yes, there is um, a link to colonialism in that struggle as well, because as we know that some European countries have um, settled into the continent of Africa and deprived the continent of Africa of some of their precious resources. And so there is that struggle there, but the struggle is that Africans have never had to contend with white supremacy, which is which is quite different from colonialism. Because in my own view, is that whenever there is colonialism, you have settlers coming into uh, an African continent, and they are, I guess, in a way, uh, befriending. And this is not in all cases, but in some cases, they are befriending the people of that continent. And uh, while they're befriending people of that continent, they are actually exploiting those people, which is quite different from what Black Americans experienced while they are suffering under the boot of white supremacy, because that experience is all about exploitation and oppression, and it's never about friendly relations. So I think that that's the difference, because when you are talking about settler colonialism, again, when settlers go onto the continent of Africa, there is this initiation of trying to establish friendly relations. And while those friendly relations are established, then what happens after that is that that continent and those nations within that continent, the continent of Africa, are being exploited. Whereas with Black Americans in the United States, we've always been subjugated and experienced uh, a system of institutional and systemic racism, which again is quite different from colonialism. And so now, jumping forward, there is, to reiterate, there is tension in the United States of America, because right now uh, there has been these immigration policies that have been quite aggressive, and those immigration policies are capturing migrants, and some of those migrants are individuals in the African diaspora. And so the African diaspora has raised the question as to why there is not that unity between Black Americans and Africans at this point in time. And so the argument that some social media influencers have raised is that whenever Black Americans are trying to level themselves up and to gain equal rights and to um, eradicate or yeah, so eradicate the system of white supremacy in the United States, we are often uh, set back, because what is happening is that, and so some of the social media influencers who are talking about this, and so I'm listening to their stories and listening to their commentary, and what they are saying is that some members in the African diaspora are actually, how do they put it? They're trying to, uh, how do they how do they say it? I don't know. I can't remember exactly the phrase that they use, but it's more like becoming white adjacent, or having having more access to, or not having more access, but uh, trying to tokenize himself or to be more try to establish themselves with white supremacy, whereas when they're establishing themselves in the nation and adopting these ideologies that are very, I guess, Eurocentric in some cases, or maybe even adopting the ideology that is harmful to Black Americans. What often happens is when those ideologies are adopted, um, what happens is that Africans in the diaspora will go against Black American people. And so, as you know, the Black American community has gone through a lot, and we have civil rights leaders that have, fought for voting rights and fought for freedoms. So, for example, the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education, this was a court case that integrated schools. And so, if Black Americans never fought for uh, integrators, well, fought for integration through that case, there is a possibility that schools would still be segregated. Now, it's important to understand that some schools are still segregated in the United States. So, when we think about private schools, those private schools are segregated because most of the times, if you are very wealthy, there's a generational wealth gap in the United States where most people that are in the dominant society hold most of the wealth. And so when we're thinking about that, most of those private schools are in wealthy areas, whereas some of the public schools are in areas that are not wealthy. But Brown versus the Board of Education is just one case. There are other cases as well. But again, when we remember Rosa Parks, what she did was she sat at the front of the bus. And if you remember during that time, of course, this was during the Jim Crow era where Blacks had to drink from a separate water fountain. Blacks had to sit at the back of the bus. And if it wasn't for Black Americans actually rebelling, and I'm not talking about rebelling in a way that is very violent, but rebelling by saying no, right? And continuing by saying no. If it wasn't for Black Americans rebelling and saying no to uh, racialized and prejudiced practices in the United States, then some of those practices would still be here today. Now, we can't deny that it is still divided in the United States, and there's still a long way to go. And with this new administration, one can only tell what's going to happen if there's going to be more division, right? But this is what I think some of those social media influencers in the Black American community are coming from. So, Black Americans have done, and some of this I am going to be repeating, but um, what I'm trying to do is just put it all together so that it makes sense. So, right now, Black Americans, what we have suffered from in the United States is a system that is very prejudiced. It's systemic racism, it's systemic, institutional racism. And so, what is that, right? So, when we're thinking about institutional racism and systemic racism, one way to look at it, one way that you can look at it is like this. It's where a group of people, and so this is not the sociological definition or even the dictionary definition of institutional racism, but I just kind of want to illustrate and paint a picture for you. Say, for instance, you have a problem with a person, or you have a problem in your social life. And I'll give myself example. Let's say, for instance, I have a problem with a person in society, or if I have a problem with an organization or I have a problem with a group? Well, through institutional and systemic racism, it would be very difficult for me to get those institutions or those groups to back me up. And so, for example, if I am discriminated against in my job, it's very difficult to go out and get a group of people to come and back me up. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this does happen. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. Like you may say, Kiana, well, what about George Floyd? Didn't people come out and protest during the George Floyd uh, unalivement? And yes, they did. But we are only talking about one case. And to understand systemic and institutional racism, you have to look at multiple cases, right? And so if we have 50 Black Americans in one room and we are investigating and we're conducting research on this, if you have 50 Black Americans in one room, you asked each Black American, have they been able to rely on the police department? Have they been able to rely on the criminal justice system? Have they been able to rely on institutions to back them up whenever they are experiencing a problem, whether that's with housing, whether that's with, within their community, whether that's in the workplace, etc. Majority of those Black people are going to say that no, they haven't had those institutions to back them up. And this is quite different from white people in America, because when white people in America have a problem, whether that is a legitimate problem or whether the situation is benign, you have institutions backing them up to say that those feelings are okay. So, for example, in many instances before cell phones existed, what often happened was individuals within the and so individuals within I guess within white America. um Hold on, let me see where it's hold on. So you had individuals within white America, they would complain about a particular issue. So for example, if they didn't like the way that someone was looking at them, if they didn't like someone that was in their neighborhood, if they didn't like how someone talked to them, if they didn't like the way that they were getting service, what they would do is call law enforcement. And law enforcement would come and usually arrest the Black person. But now that cell phones have been invented, Black Americans felt and often feel that it's important to take video camera of their interactions, whether that is police interactions, whether that's interactions with white people in the community. Black Americans are taking footage of each interaction because this is a story that can't be twisted, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you an example. When I was here in Belfast, I went to um, a law firm called Phoenix Law, and I went to so I had an appointment. So I didn't arrive, without an appointment or unannounced. I had an appointment. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when I arrived at Phoenix Law, I said, hey, I want to speak about this particular issue, which is a human rights violation. And they told me that they could not represent my case. And I was like, oh, you just told me that I had an appointment and that, you would listen to me. And keep in mind that they didn't actually take me into the office or even discuss the issue with me at all. They just came out and said that they couldn't represent my case. And I was like, but I didn't tell you anything. Like, I'm having this human rights concern. You're a human rights firm. Like, why are you unable to represent my case? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think that a person came out of the office and I didn't know who he was, but he stormed into the lobby area where I was sitting. And keep in mind, I was sitting down. And so he stormed in and he was standing over me and yelling at me. And so, at that time, like I started recording the situation because like I didn't know who he was. I was just sitting down and he stormed in the office and came up to me. And so I started to record because I didn't know who he was. And I was recording the entire time. And it made me afraid because, again, like I didn't know who he was. And so when I stepped down and he was telling me like to leave, and I was like, well, you're a human rights firm. I don't understand why you're telling me to leave. Right. And so we kind of went back and forth. We kind of went back and forth, with having, with me trying to explain why I was there, he telling me to leave because I was trying to explain to him that I had an appointment and he was telling me to leave. And so it just didn't really make sense to me, right? And so as I was leaving, what he did was he called the police because because I didn't leave soon enough and I didn't leave when he told me to. And so like I was recording and I was just telling him that I was going through transnational repression because I was afraid. And so that fell on deaf ears. And when I stepped out of the office, there was the PS and I um, that had arrived, and behind PS and I was an unmarked police car. And so PS and I went upstairs and they were telling me that okay, so this lawyer followed me downstairs and he said that I had assaulted the receptionist. Ladies and gentlemen, you have my word that I didn't assault anyone. I didn't put my hands on anybody. I didn't do anything of the sort. I know better. And so when he said that, I was taken aback that he had said that about me. And so I was like, "No, I didn't." I said, "I had the whole situation on video camera." And ladies and gentlemen, not only was I recording, but the receptionist was recording as well. So we were recording at the same time. And so PS and I, they didn't, say, "Can I look at your footage?" Ladies and gentlemen, I was telling PS and I was like, "Listen, I have the entire incident on video recording, the entire incident." And ladies and gentlemen, that wasn't even enough for him. And so what they did, ladies and gentlemen, was when that unmarked police car showed up, which I believe was, the Republic of Ireland or the United States, this intelligence agency working with both of them, when they showed up, they were telling the police officer to put me in the car. And so the police officer said that I had to get into the car. And ladies and gentlemen, I was afraid to tell you the truth. Like I was like almost brought to tears. And but my mind kept saying, Quianna, like you have this on recording, you have this incident, the entire incident, on video camera. So you have nothing to worry about. But ladies and gentlemen, my mind was telling me that I'm in the my so I was in the police car, right? And all I could think about is that the officer didn't stop to look at the footage that I had. He didn't stop to even take a look at it. And ladies and gentlemen, what I think happened is when they went upstairs, they asked the receptionist if they could review her footage. Now, you see what I'm talking about? Like her footage was good enough to be reviewed, but my footage was not. And so they asked her if they could review her footage, and they likely seen on her footage that I didn't assault anybody, that I didn't touch anybody. And I still have that footage. So like, when I look back at it, like I am so deeply disturbed that that took place in a human rights law firm where I was trying to get legal representation. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you can kind of see how like I didn't have these institutions to back me up to say that my version of events was accurate, even though I had video footage. None of that even made a difference. Like they didn't even consult. me or look at my footage. What they did was they actually went upstairs and consulted the footage of the receptionist to see exactly what was going on. And to reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, I am old enough to know, especially in countries that I am a foreigner and in systems where I am on the lower end of the totem pole. I am more informed now than ever and smart enough to know that this is not the place to assault anyone or any country where you are a foreign citizen, or excuse me, a foreign national. And so the fact that that allegation was launched against me, ladies and gentlemen, just keep in mind, like, what if I didn't record that situation? Like, what if I didn't record? What if I had walked out of there, didn't record? They would have taken his word against mine, and I would have been in jail. Now, what I think I'll get into how the heuristics of this works in another video. That's not what I'm talking about in this video. But ladies and gentlemen, that's just an example how, like, this is what Black Americans talk about. And I think that this is what Africans haven't quite understood. This is how it works, is that there is a covert level of racism. Now, was that a, a racial encounter? I believe it was. And the reason why I say it was, now, before I get into that, is Belfast, um, you know, is everyone in Belfast racist? No. Is the all of the institutions in Belfast racist? The answer is no. But when I am talking about institutional power, so when we talk about, in order to practice racism, you have to have prejudice plus power. And that attorney knew in that moment that when he weaponized the police department, the PSNI, when he weaponized that police department, that he knew that there was likely nothing that I could do about it. But I also think that they felt guilty because this is a human rights law firm that actually deals with instances of police brutality and deals with a lot of complaints within prison systems. And so I think that they felt guilty about that allegation that they made against me, and they retracted that allegation. But ladies and gentlemen, that's just an example. And so when Black Americans are in the United States of America, this is what we are dealing with on a daily basis. And so, how Africans come into the equation is that when we are trying to dismantle this kind of systemic and institutional racism, we actually have Africans in the United States that are upholding these systems of oppression that in the long run not only hurt us but actually go to hurt them as well. So for example, now look what's happening in the United States is that for several years during the Biden administration, what was happening is that Black Americans were saying and articulating and speaking out that there's racism on both sides in the Republican Party and also in the Democratic Party. And so we were getting a lot of pushback from the African diaspora. Now, I just, my personal opinion as to why we're getting pushback from the African diaspora is because I think that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And then two, there is a lot of ignorance around racial justice and racial injustice. And so when we were expressing that this is on both sides and that we are trying to develop ourselves and to try and get rights established for ourselves, then we had government officials. We had the Federal Bureau of Investigations. We had the Central Intelligence Agency, contracting immigrants from, all ethnicities to go against Black Americans. And this is something that is talked about in a lot of books that are written on the FBI and COINTELPRO. This is a tactic that the FBI is really known for using and weaponizing against Black Americans, is colluding with immigrant communities to go against Black American people. And so another example of this is when I was in the Republic of Ireland, ladies and gentlemen, and I was in direct provision. And people have their own opinions about what happened. And of course, they're making me out to be the folk devil in the Republic of Ireland. And I'll take that. Maybe I'll start a YouTube channel or a podcast, folk devil, I'll make something out of it. But at any rate, they tried to make me out to be the folk devil. But ladies and gentlemen, what they're missing from this entire story is that when I was living in direct provision, I had immigrants going up against me. And keep in mind, these were people that I was trying to build community with, trying to build relationships with, trying to love, trying to have friendships with, helping them, trying to establish bonds. The authority figures who are working in intelligence, we have these intelligence agencies. It's immediately clear now. We have these intelligence agencies right now that are in the Republic of Ireland that don't want certain communities in their country, and that's clear. And ladies and gentlemen, what we have, to tell you the truth, is that whenever Americans step on the soil, and I'm confused as to why, the United States has a relationship with the Republic of Ireland. Because I'm very confused about it, because there seems to be a huge disdain for Americans in the Republic of Ireland. But what you have is that whenever Americans step in onto the soil of the Republic of Ireland and file an international protection claim, then you have intelligence agencies that will use a lottery system in the direct provision institution. And so what do I mean by that? So essentially what will happen is that these intelligence agencies will, you know, uh, communicate with the asylum seekers in direct provision and offer them asylum. International protection will and so they will go through a speedy process, or their applications will be approved if they work with these intelligence agencies to push Americans out of the direct provision institution. Of course, I talk about this in other videos of mine. It's called transnational repression. And so, think about it. You have, not only are you going up against this intelligence agency who is hiding behind a camera, or cloaking themselves behind institutions where you don't know the exact person that's meeting out these orders, but you have your own community turning against you because they're desperate, right? They want to be able to stay in this country, and they don't know who you are. They don't know who you are. They don't know a lot about you. All they know is what these intelligence agencies are telling them about you. And so they're victims as well in this entire process. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I experienced when I was, of course, in the Republic of Ireland is just think about it. I was in a direct provision institution with, uh, this is like a housing complex with at least 150 asylum seekers. And then you have like 60% of those that are saying yes, that they will go against you. And just think about it. You're having this happen to you every single day. And the authority figure is giving them these instructions to do this to you. And what is this rooted in, ladies and gentlemen, is the question. What is this all rooted in? This is all rooted in white supremacy. When you think about it clearly, ladies and gentlemen, my international protection claim made allegations against the United States. And so my allegations was that the United States was put me through racialized practices, and that I suffered discrimination in the United States. And I believe that this is the reason why the United States and the Republic of Ireland are going after me. Now, to tell you the truth, after when I was in direct provision and I was experiencing this intimidation, of course, I didn't know exactly what was going on, and it was my first time going through it, right? So it's my first time going through an entire community trying to make me feel ousted and isolated and exiled from the community in which I lived in. And so as I was going through this, my only thought was, initially, when I first was going through this, what I thought was, okay, this is the community. And I didn't know that it was an intelligence agency behind this, or I didn't know that it was like a government official behind this. And so at that point, I thought, okay, this is just immigrants that are behind it. And then as I learned more and observed more, paid more attention, it's the puzzles of the pieces started to come together. And at that point, the damage had already been done. I had already spoken out against this protected group in the in the Republic of Ireland. And after I spoke out against this group, because of course it was this group that was putting into practice this oppression, when I spoke out against the group and I did so publicly, I was canceled and am still suffering from that. So, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Black Americans normally don't have these large groups to back us up whenever we are going through systemic racism or institutional racism. And even here in Belfast, I am understanding what that feels like, because I have reached out to multiple African leaders here in Belfast who I like a lot. And so I'm not going to stop liking them. I'm not going to dislike them, because I know that this is a very powerful person in the dominant society that is turning these people against me. And although I can't understand how there is not a first chance, and that there is not um, a person, like, I would never be a person that says, okay, I'm just going to cut a person off without hearing their story and not understanding what's going on in their life and what they've gone through. Although I won't do that, I know that other people do that. And so I'm starting to learn now that the residual effects of what is happening in the United States with the immigration issues and the rift between Black Americans and Africans are actually trickling over to the uh, European Union or the European states. And I'm feeling the effects of that here in Northern Ireland. And to reiterate, so while undergoing acts of transnational repression, I have reached out to uh, African leaders. There has not been many Black American leaders here in Northern Ireland, and so if there are some, I haven't met them. But I have reached out to African leaders in the diaspora here in Northern Ireland, and I have tried to explain to them my story and really sit with them to to explore this story and to try and build community with them. and I have been blocked by them. So, for example, you know, an organization that I still do respect a lot, an organization that I still do have hope for, and still hope that one day that we can be friends and one day that we can sit at the table and have discussion is ACSONI, which is an African Caribbean organization here in Northern Ireland. I hope that we can unite and really see that there is a very toxic authority figure at the very top that is actually keeping us divided, but they don't understand that. And so, what often happens is these people with this power in the dominant society will offer. So, for example, I think that what they do is that they offer positions to the African diaspora. They not only do they offer them positions, but they probably give them incentives in some instances, and I'm not saying in all instances, but in some instances they will tokenize them. And if you haven't, so as an African American, I have had leaders that I can look up to and uh, idolize, or to look up to as an icon or a mentor. So, for example, we have the great Martin Luther King Jr. We have Rosa Parks. We have uh, Bayard Rustin. Am I pronouncing his name wrong? It's Bayard. It's a difficult name, isn't it? Let me see how to pronounce his name. Bayard. Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin. Always had difficulty pronouncing his first name. Bayard Rustin. And so we have Bayard Rustin. We have Malcolm X. We have multiple leaders in the United States. Angela Davis. We have multiple Black leaders in the United States that have created a blueprint on which we build off of to solidify and to secure our rights. And I'm not saying that members of the African diaspora don't have that. I'm sure they do. And I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of leaders that they can look up to. But there seems to be, when we're talking about in positions of power, when there is this whenever there is an instruction from the dominant society to go against Black Americans, it seems as if members that are in these positions of power that are from the African diaspora choose to do that. Now, Black Americans, we don't really do that because we understand that there is a deep struggle, and that we understand that, white supremacy is a very deceptive practice, and in a sense, white supremacy can be a religion, or looked at as a religious or theological practice in which it is in some sense it can be viewed as like a theological or religious cult. And we understand that quite clearly in the United States. But I think what's different and what's keeping Black Americans and Africans divided is that we understand that there is overt racism and covert racism. And I think that when it comes to the diaspora, the African diaspora, and I'm not speaking about everyone in the African diaspora, so don't come after me. And I'm pretty sure that the dominant society will clip this video up and they will send it to like how they've been doing. Is that they've been clipping my videos up and sending it to different people so that they won't support me and so that they can continue to oust me. But that is okay. But what's different between Black Americans, in my personal opinion, and the diaspora the African diaspora is that we understand and are able to identify the signs and the nuances, the microaggressions that incorporate or encapsulate covert racism and overt racism. And I think that for the African diaspora, because they are coming from, I think, the continent of Africa, I think they expect in many instances for racism to be very overt. And so if there is not an overt practice going on, then for them, they don't understand, how am I saying this right? So what I believe is that members of the African diaspora haven't, some members haven't been able to identify those instances and nuances of covert racism because their understanding is that racism is oftentimes overt rather than covert. And like to reiterate, this is quite different from our experience as Black Americans in the United States. And what do I mean by this? And so when the dominant society comes to Africans in the diaspora and tells the Africans in the diaspora negative and harmful things about Black Americans, and oftentimes they give them incentives to go against Black Americans. I think that at times, all the members in the African diaspora can do is really think about themselves at some times and think about those incentives. And you may say, Kiana, well, what did you do when you were in the Republic of Ireland? Didn't you uh, get with Derek Bly, and didn't you uh, have him in your article? Ladies and gentlemen, that is true. I did talk to Derek Bly, but you have to remember that I didn't know who Derek Bly was when I first met him. I didn't know who he was. No one explained to me who he was. All I knew is that he was speaking out against a practice of protecting women and protecting children. And that's all I seen. And I didn't see anything about anything else, right? And so when he was speaking out about that, I was seeing something in direct provision that made me feel very uncomfortable. And so I spoke out about that, and I couldn't get any assistance from any of the any of the asylum seeker communities. I couldn't get any assistance from any of the refugee organizations. No one would back me up. And so I wrote a story about it. I asked his opinion on it. And not only did I ask his opinion on it, but I asked the opinion from NAS, the Refugee uh, Migrants Rights Center. NASC made the decision not to respond, and only Derek Bly responded. Now, after that situation happened, I was canceled, and Derek Bly, his celebrity went up the roof. Like, he gained a Wikipedia page, he gained thousands of followers, and I was the person who the intelligence agencies went after. They didn't go after Derek Bly. They didn't harass him. They didn't put him through, this panoptical system or this panoptical model of surveillance. They only went after me, and they only attacked me. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you can kind of see how certain groups are subject to oppression and others aren't, because all I did was wrote an article, and I explained what I felt was happening, what I saw was happening, and asked for opinions. And the article, you can look at it now. The article is very balanced, but yet intelligence agencies came after me. and the intelligence agencies attacked me, and everybody hated me. And I'm very confused about that because we are living in a world, or you would almost think as if like there is no journalistic privilege. You would almost think that like it's a crime to write an article about your own environment. You must keep in mind that I was a bona fide asylum seeker in the Republic of Ireland. So I was part of the community and I was writing about what I saw. And I wasn't doing it from the lens of a spy or working for, someone in government. That's not what I was doing. I was doing it from genuine concern about what was going on. And of course, I was ousted for what I had saw, and I was ousted for what I had wrote about. And until this day, I still don't understand it because you have these groups that are talking about protect women, protect the right of children, and protect the right of women. And yet, when I was talking about those issues, they went against me. So it doesn't make sense to me. But so that's what I think is why that rift happens, or is happening between Black Americans and uh, Africans in the diaspora, is that when Africans in the diaspora, when they come to the United States, and I must be clear, I'm not saying that all Africans in the diaspora, but when some of the Africans in the diaspora are within the United States, so either that's through the asylum process, or whether that's through birthright citizenship, whether that's through marriage, whether that's through an immigration process such as an HB1 visa, we do have the dominant society being very manipulative, and the dominant society will oftentimes befriend the Africans in the diaspora and give them instructions to oppress us and to go after us or to talk against us so they won't have to do it. So for example, we have Candace Owens. Now, my feeling about Candace Owens. I think she's a very beautiful woman, and I think that she is articulate and that she can formulate a convincing argument at times. But what is Candace Owens doing now? She is talking very negatively about Black Americans, and she's not consistent in her approach. Now, although I do like Candace Owens, I do notice this about her, that she is not consistent in her approach. So, for example, sometimes she will bring up certain topics that she will use as a dog whistle to uh, go after Black Americans, or to pander to her crowd or her base, right? So, for example, she'll bring up a story sometimes, and while she's talking about this story, she'll only talk about it from the lens of the dominant society, but she won't give any nuance to the story. And what's disconcerting about that is that Black Americans have, whenever members in the dominant society have gone up against Candace Owens or tried to take her down, Black Americans have, gave her insulation. So, for example, when the Daily Wire terminated her employment, she received insulation from a lot of Black podcasters, such as Joe Budden, not only Joe Budden, but Nick Cannon. She received it from uh, The Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, and many other Black podcasters. So she received that insulation so that she wouldn't lose her status. Not saying that she actually needed that insulation, but Black Americans automatically gave her that insulation because that's how we are. Is that we understand that those in the dominant society can take you down without you having anything to fall back on. And so what we do is we stand behind you so that you have some insulation. That's what I did when I was here, ladies and gentlemen, in Northern Ireland, when Takura Makoni, who is a policy advisor for ACSONI, he was receiving, I think, what happened? He uh, there was a controversy where he was living in a neighborhood and there was people that were actually spray painting signs around his home that he should be getting out of the neighborhood. So basically, these were signs of intimidation that was trying to force him out of the neighborhood. And when I read about that, like, I was heartbroken because I was like, he shouldn't be going through this. And so all I could do as a person with no power is write that it was wrong and to speak out against it, and that's what I did. And so I wrote uh, a couple of articles about how this was wrong, how there needed to be more cultural communication, how there needed to be, groups coming together to try to understand where this division and where this tension was coming from. And I really tried to have Takura's back during this difficult time. But when I called on Takura to have my back, he didn't. And he abandoned me, he isolated me. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking from the lens of people in the community that should be that have a similar conflict and that should come together in solidarity to address that conflict. And no other way am I talking about this. And so when I tried to rely on his support, he didn't support me, and nor did Axani, nor did the organization support me. And my conclusion as to why they didn't support me was because there was a very and still is, there's a very powerful person in the dominant society that is very toxic, that is creating this division between people like me and the African diaspora. And so this toxic leader that is sitting at the very top is telling members in the African diaspora to go against me. And they're not stopping back. They're not taking a step back to say, wait a minute, let me see, let me evaluate this. Let me examine this. Like, everything that I've learned throughout the years, like, am I applying that to this situation? So for example, when I was in when I actually visited the Exani office. Now, things could change now, like, it could look completely different in 2025, but when I was there, in 2024, when I visited the office, I believe in 2024, early in 2024, Axani had pictures of Malcolm X and, uh, Martin Luther King on their walls. And so when I walked in there, I was like, "Okay, I'm in the right place, like, these people are going to understand exactly what I'm going through." And so when I tried to have a discussion with them, I said, "You know what? I'm going through something that's political repression. It's called transnational repression. It's kind of like COINTELPRO, but COINTELPRO happening abroad." And I probably didn't say it that eloquently, but I did try to explain it that way. And I was of the opinion under the assumption that they would actually understand what I was going through and catch on very quickly and say, "Okay, well, we understand what you're going through, and we are going to help you and make sure that you're not going through this at all." But ladies and gentlemen, that is not what happened. And I'm disappointed that people are using our leaders, y- and having them up in their place of business and not really respecting the journey and the tenets and the ideology and the philosophy of those leaders. I think it's highly disrespectful to the leaders, MLK, who preached about unity and who actually went through COINTELPRO, who the Federal Bureau of Investigation put him through COINTELPRO. I think it's highly inappropriate for you to have a picture frame of MLK up in your place of business and to let a Black American in your presence go through a practice of COINTELPRO when you are in a position of power to speak your voice and to possibly stop it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking about people that are not in positions of power. You know that you are in a position of power if you can get your voice, if you can get a newspaper to listen to your voice. And so that is oftentimes a barometer that I use to make a decision whether or not a person is in a position of power, is where they can call on the media and the media will actually write a story whenever they are going through something or whenever they speak out against something. Because what that means is that the media is using you as, or excuse me, the media is considering that you are a expert on a particular issue. And so that's not any ill feelings against ACSONI. I still respect the organization immensely. I'm still going to have respect for the organization. My respect is not going to subside for ACSONI, but this is just some illumination on what I've gone through and how I've been abandoned by leaders in the African diaspora who I've done nothing to. Like, I've actually never done anything wrong to any members of ACSONI. Ladies and gentlemen, the only thing that I've done is try to go there and get them to support me. And they made the decision not to do that without knowing me. Like, I'm in a new country. So I'm in Northern Ireland, and my only interaction with these organizations, ladies and gentlemen, is requesting that they really come on board to stop a practice that will eventually impact them in the future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this gets me to my final point, is that we often don't see how policies and practices can impact us as well. Oftentimes, we think that we are insulated and protected from a particular policy and practice. And so, here, ladies and gentlemen, uh, leaders in the African diaspora think that if these intelligence agencies are putting me through uh, transnational repression, then that they're insulated from it and that they are safe from it. But they have a rude awakening, because when you allow a practice like this to happen, what it does is it actually becomes precedent and allows this practice to continue. And so now you allowed it to happen to me, right? So you didn't speak out when it's happening to me. And so there's a precedent there. So now when someone comes in your community and they do it to someone in your community, then the intelligence agencies are going to come to those same organizations and say, "Hey, well, remember, you okayed it in this instance, so you must okay it in this instance as well." And that's kind of how it works. And then in other it won't be a similar instance, but I think when we are looking at it from a different point of view, these intelligence agencies, once they're done with doing this to me, if they ever finish with it, then they will move on and they will do it to another vulnerable person. And do you think that that's going to be somebody in the dominant society? No. And that is, now I'm connecting that to what we're seeing So now that we have an understanding about that, how does this connect to what we're seeing in the United States of America right now? So, ladies and gentlemen, what was happening is that members of the African diaspora, and this is not to say that I agree with what is going on in the United States of America. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm giving context to how this develops and how this happens. And so members in the African diaspora were colluding with uh, the dominant society to enact oppression upon Black Americans. And now look what's happening is that that same oppression has ricocheted and, you know, back to them. And now there is these oppressive policies, immigration policies that are in place through an executive order that is uprooting members of the African diaspora from the United States of America. And let's look at it even more. So, for example, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at it even more deeply. What is the Trump administration doing now? So we know that there has been in the United States, there has been these protests because of the Israel and Palestine conflict. And so there has been protest after protest after protest after protest in the United States in 2024. And there has been some protests in 2025 as well. And these were large protests. And a lot of the people that came out to protest were immigrants. And so, what is the Trump administration doing now? The Trump administration is saying that anybody who has protested in those Palestinian protests, which they are calling Hamas, those people's, those foreign nationals, their visas are being revoked. And, ladies and gentlemen, I tried to warn people not to go out and protest and to be very careful about how they protest. If you go out and protest, be careful about how you protest. You have a right to protest. It's a right. And a state should not stop you from going out and protesting, but you must be strategic and careful how you protest. And ladies and gentlemen, I saw how this was going to go. That's why I didn't attend any protests while I was abroad. I think I attended like one protest in the Republic of Ireland, and I was in that protest to get some signatures. And when I was in the protest, I was actually taking pictures of the social movements to really try and understand like what was going on, because I was in a new country and really didn't understand like what the issues were that they were protesting about. And so, you know, I had a new camera and was out taking images. And so when I was in Northern Ireland, there was one of those Israel Palestine protests, and actually went out and looked to see what that was. And I don't know, at that moment, something hit me. Like there was like this intuition. There's like, Kia, don't be at these protests. Kia, don't be at these protests. And I don't know, from that moment on, I decided not to go to any protest. And now, like, I think that my intuition was correct, because now people are starting to pay the price for going to these protests. And so it's a difficult story. That's not to say that you don't have a right to protest, but it's difficult for people who are not directly involved in the conflict, because again, that could be misconstrued as your intentions for being at a protest. And so I didn't want that to happen. So that's why I didn't go. But back to the topic at hand, as you can see, what's happening is that there are policies in place in the United States where people are being stripped of their visa because they went out and protested for Palestine. And although I don't think that that is correct or that's the right thing to do, the framing that's coming out of the Trump administration is that they're framing this as members or foreign nationals who went out and protested for Hamas. And so that framing is saying that those foreign nationals were protesting in support of Hamas, and therefore those visas should be revoked. And you can kind of see what's happening now is that, we should never support any act of extremism. And so, like, I condemn Hamas. I always make sure that I do condemn Hamas. But I think what was happening is that some protesters weren't condemning Hamas, and some protesters were carrying flags that were having, I think, that was associated with that group. And so I don't know, like, the implications about how that's going to impact foreign nationals, how many foreign nationals are going to lose their visas, but it seems to be severe. It seems to be a very severe circumstance that some foreign nationals are currently in the United States of America. And so, how do we solve this problem? I think that the way that we solve the problem is to realize that Black Americans and Africans, that we are cut from the same cloth, and that we have similar DNA, and that we owe it to each other to really have each other's back and to stay in solidarity with each other. Because one thing that most Black Americans don't do, now don't get me wrong, we do have members in the Black community that are on the far right, that are in support of the far right, and we call those people out because some of those policies are very harmful to Black. And so what we try to do, ladies and gentlemen, is that we really do try and call those people out because they can be harmful. And again, I think what's important to realize is that we are always going to try and fight for equality. And our fight is always going to be within the confines of the law, and it's always going to be peaceful. And we are always going to do what is correct for us and to try and secure our rights. Now, members in on the right, and so again, if you have been following my politics, you know that um, I am a liberal and I have liberal beliefs, and and that's probably just never going to change. But we do have people that are on the right that are very harmful, that are on, the Republicans are very harmful. And these Republicans, um, their ideology is very harmful as well. And so, not a lot of people do understand the way in which those policies have a trickle down effect on Black Americans. Some of the Black activists that I do listen to, they are of the opinion that some of those policies that are happening now are not going to impact Black Americans. And so I can't argue with that because I haven't been able to see how that is impacting Black Americans. Only when there is a policy that is designed that is going to impact Black Americans can I speak out about it. But there are other ways in which verbiage and phraseology does impact Black Americans. There is, if we look at how the dismantling of many decisions, so for right now, if we look at it from history, if we go back in history, if we go backwards, so some of those policies, some of those rights that are being dismantled are dismantling rights. It's going backward, backward, and backward. So what was the first to go? So some of those rights that were first to go was LGBTQ rights and then women's rights. And it's only we can only come to the conclusion that the next rights that are going to be dismantled by the Republican Party are Black rights or civil rights. Because let's look at history. Let's go forward in history. We had civil rights, we had women's rights, and then we had LGBTQ rights. Now they're dismantling LGBTQ rights. They have dismantled some of the women's rights. And are we next? Well, this pattern is demonstrating that we're next. And so, where do we go from here? I think that where we go from here is that there is an opportunity for Black Americans and Africans in the diaspora to come together. There is an opportunity for us to sit down and deal with our differences and to now just because we sit down and we have discussions about our own internal conflicts, that doesn't mean that we're planning something against the dominant society or that we're trying to take it over. No, we're coming down to settle an internal conflict. It's like a family conflict. So just because a family sits down and they settle their conflict doesn't mean that because they're settling their conflict that they are planning something, something ominous in the future. No. So I think that Africans and Black Americans can sit down and really rectify the differences that we have. And I think, and I would really like to do that here in Belfast with some of the members in the African community. I would really like to sit down and have a discussion with some of those African members in the diaspora. I would really like to do that because I think that there is a conversation to be had. And I think right now what's happening is that we've been having a very toxic authority figure sitting at the very top that's been pulling the strings for way too long. This very toxic authority figure is causing a lot of division. This very toxic authority figure is causing a lot of hate. And this very toxic authority figure needs to be called out. And I think if we all, myself included, because sometimes they think, okay, if we exclude Quianna, then everything will be okay. No, the thing is if we excluded this toxic authority figure who is using its coercive, its reward power, if we called this person out, then we would see some changes. And I think that that's the difference between Black Americans and Africans in the diaspora is that Black Americans often call these practices out on a regular basis, whereas Africans in the diaspora are can sometimes be complacent. And that's not all Africans in the diaspora. I've seen some Africans who stand up to oppressive practices and call it out. And this is what I want to see happen this month. In the United States, this is Black History Month. And I believe from February to April in Europe, in countries like the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, it is Frederick Douglass Week or Frederick Douglass Month. And I would like to see us come together and really resolve our differences because I think that that's what Frederick Douglass would want us to do. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Do you think that Black Americans and Africans can work through their differences? What do you think about what do you think about like my position when I'm talking about institutional racism and systemic racism? Systemic racism. Do you think I'm wrong about this? Do you think that I have a lot to learn about this? Do you think that I'm hitting the nail right on the head? Tell me. I want to know. And what do you think about what's going on in the United States? Do you think that this is going to trickle down into the European Union? Do you think that immigrants in the European Union are going to be impacted by similar policies? Do you think that the European Union is going to develop similar policies? These are all questions that I want to know. Until next time, bye bye.